Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. The Matrix is popularly understood as a high-octane cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked artificial intelligence and the importance of questioning one's reality. In this consensus reading, Neo is the quintessential chosen one who frees humanity from a digital dystopia, a messianic figure whose journey serves as a power fantasy triumph over a soulless, automated regime. However, this interpretation is incomplete, as it reduces a complex ontological inquiry into a mere rebellion narrative. The subversion lies in recognizing that the film is not a battle of man versus machine, but a sophisticated exploration of the Baudrillardian simulation, where the human desire for a real truth is just another layer of programming. The film's most jarring anomaly, Cypher's desperate betrayal, serves as the anchor for this thesis. The human element is so fundamentally tethered to the comforts of the illusion that the simulation is not merely a prison, but a self-sustaining psychological necessity. The Matrix operates within a bleak economic reality where the human body is harvested as a biological battery, the ultimate commodification of labor. This architecture of control is visually reinforced through a color-coded geography. The world is rendered in cold, industrial blue-grays, while the Matrix is bathed in sickly, synthetic greens. This aesthetic divide suggests that reality itself has been curated to maintain a hierarchy of perception. The machines do not merely enforce order through force, they rely on an epistemological monopoly. By feeding the populace a comfortable, digital facsimile of the late 20th century, the system ensures that the vast majority never question their surroundings. Here, the baseline normal is a state of total, blissful ignorance, where freedom is an abstract concept that cannot compete with the tangible, sensory satisfaction of a perfectly simulated steak. The human element of the film is defined by the trauma of awakening. For Neo, the shift from the hacker Thomas Anderson to the One is not a transition of power, but an epistemic fracture. His reality breaks the moment he realizes that his entire sense of self, his name, his memories, his very ego, was an artificial construct. This trauma is physically manifested. His somatic response to the simulation, vomiting after his first exit, proves that the mind does not easily accept the rejection of its own history. The machines understand this vulnerability better than the humans do. The antagonist, Agent Smith, is the perfect manifestation of this system's logic. He is a pragmatist who views humanity as a virus because we are inherently chaotic and unwilling to adapt to the perfect order of the simulation. Smith's hatred for the stink of humanity is, ironically, the most honest admission of the system's failure to fully replace the human spirit with pure data. Philosophically, the film delves deep into Cartesian doubt and the nature of the real. Morpheus acts as the arbiter of truth, offering Neo a choice that is less about liberation and more about the acceptance of a harsher, more miserable existence. This is the central ethical dilemma. Is it morally superior to live in a desert of the real than in a beautiful, synthetic dream? The film's answer is inherently existentialist. Neo does not find liberation in the absence of the Matrix, he finds it in the act of choosing. By rejecting the blue pillar of comfort, Neo engages in an absurd revolt against a deterministic universe. He refuses to allow his fate to be dictated by the systemic feedback loop, even when the oracle suggests his path is already laid out. His agency is found not in the defeat of the machines, but in his willingness to define his own meaning in a world where truth is entirely subjective. The craft of the film acts as the final confirmation of this digital instability. The iconic bullet time sequences and the erratic, high-velocity camera work during fight scenes serve to remind the viewer that the laws of physics within the Matrix are merely lines of code. The digital effects are not just spectacle, they are visual representations of the glitch in the system. When Neo finally manipulates the Matrix, the cinematography shifts, the frame becomes fluid, and the rigid architecture of the city begins to bend. This is the visual language of a system collapsing under the weight of an individual who refuses to be processed. Ultimately, the Matrix concludes not with a final victory, but with an open-ended promise of a revolution. Neo's final message to the machines, a vow to show a world where anything is possible, is not a declaration of peace, but an admission of the inherent danger of consciousness. The film suggests that the simulation is a cycle that humanity creates for itself as much as the machines create it for us. The recursive loop of the beginning and end, Neo's evolution from an isolated, alienated hacker to a herald of systemic instability, reinforces that the conflict is eternal. We are all, at various times, both the prisoner and the architect of our own reality. The enduring legacy of the film is its challenge to the audience, not to find the real world, but to realize that we are responsible for the truth we choose to inhabit. In the synthesis of its technical mastery and its grim philosophical inquiry, the film remains a chilling reminder that, so long as we prioritize comfort over the uncomfortable demands of objective truth, we are all just code waiting to be overwritten. The subversion question. The consensus regarding The Matrix is that it serves as a high-octane, Gnostic allegory for awakening. Neo is the messianic figure who casts off the blinders of digital illusion to embrace the real world, transitioning from a state of comfortable ignorance to heroic, transcendent truth. However, this reading is fundamentally incomplete, if not entirely inverted. The Matrix is not merely a tale of liberation, it is a harrowing indictment of the recursive nature of late-stage capitalism and the seductive, inescapable trap of the rebel identity. By framing the resistance as a subculture that merely validates the machine's own need for systemic optimization, the film suggests that the awakening is simply a new, more efficient layer of the simulation. The primary contradiction point lies in the role of the architect and the nature of the prophecy. The surface reading positions Morpheus as the enlightened guide, yet his faith is functionally identical to the religious indoctrination of the machines. The film's text undercuts the hero's journey by revealing that the resistance is not an anomaly to be eradicated, but a variable to be managed. The one is not a glitch in the system, but an integrated component of the machine's own stability. To ignore this is to miss the film's darkest insight, that in a world defined by total control, even the most radical rebellion is a commodity manufactured by the power structure to provide the system with the illusion of progress and the necessity of maintenance. Reframing the Matrix through a Baudrillardian lens, specifically the theory of the hyperreal, reveals that the real world of Zion is not the antithesis of the simulation, but its necessary byproduct. The film's visual language reinforces this through a rigid, binary color palette. The simulation is soaked in a sickly, jaundiced green, while the real world is rendered in cold, industrial blues and grays. This distinction is intentionally reductive, functioning as an aesthetic prop that maintains the characters' and the audience's need for a binary reality. We are encouraged to view the transition from blue to green as a move toward truth, ignoring that the characters in Zion are just as tethered to machinery, just as limited by their digital interfaces, and just as subservient to an algorithmic destiny as they were in the Matrix. The buried evidence is found in the recurring motif of déjà vu. When Neo experiences a glitch, a cat passing twice, he interprets it as a sign of systemic failure. Yet, from a structuralist perspective, this is the system performing a diagnostic, a self-correcting loop that acknowledges its own artifice while simultaneously reinforcing it. The film lingers on these moments of repetition, forcing us to ask, if the system can rewrite its own code to account for the intruder, what differentiates this hero from a virus that the machine has already accounted for? The structural tell is in the film's final sequence, where Neo achieves godlike powers within the simulation. Rather than destroying the machine, he makes a phone call to the system itself, promising to show them a world where anything is possible. This is not the end of the simulation, it is a software update. By claiming agency within the code, Neo ensures the survival of the construct he supposedly sought to dismantle. The cost of the comfortable, heroic reading is that it absolves the audience of the uncomfortable realization that we, too, prefer the simulation. We are so invested in the archetype of the chosen one that we overlook the reality that Morpheus's resistance is essentially a terrorist insurgency operating within the margins of a grid it cannot actually escape. The discomfort of the subversive reading, that Neo's struggle is a performance designed to keep the system self-optimizing, is precisely why it is avoided. It forces us to confront the fact that our own rebellions, our digital footprints, our critiques, and our countercultural identities are often the very data points the system uses to map our next behaviors. The Matrix is not a blueprint for escape, it is a mirror reflecting the inescapable realization that when you choose the red pill, you aren't leaving the prison, you are simply choosing a different cell that convinces you, through the thrill of the fight, that you are free. The anomaly question. The consensus surrounding the Matrix is that it serves as a high-octane, cyberpunk myth, a hero's journey reconfigured for the digital age, where a bored office drone discovers he is the prophesied savior of humanity. Yet, this interpretation is fundamentally incomplete. To view the film merely as an action-oriented liberation narrative is to overlook its true, far more cynical core. The Matrix is not an empowering story about rising up against a machine, but a clinical examination of the seduction of programmed belief and the terrifying, existential burden of choosing to exist in an entropic, real world that lacks the comfort of a narrative. The anomaly that forces this realization is the infamous, much-debated decision of Cypher, the crew member who chooses to betray his fellows to return to the simulation. While audiences often dismiss Cypher as a mere archetype of cowardice, he acts as the film's most honest mirror. His choice is not a mistake of the script, but the essential, missing piece of the film's philosophical puzzle. If the film were truly about the heroic triumph of human spirit, Cypher would be an aberration. Instead, he represents the logical endpoint of the film's own internal premise. When reality is revealed to be a cold, subterranean, nutrient-paced existence, truth becomes a liability. The fact that the audience finds Cypher so repulsive is proof of our own cognitive dissonance. He is simply the character who correctly identifies that the real world in the Matrix is functionally identical to the illusion. It is merely a different, more miserable system of control. This tension is mirrored in the film's architecture and visual geography, which utilizes a binary color palette to enforce this epistemic boundary. The Matrix is bathed in a sickly, jaundiced green, the color of decaying computer terminals and stagnant, artificial light, while the real world is rendered in cold, industrial blues and gritty, monochromatic grays. The film uses these visual cues not just for aesthetic contrast, but to represent the shift from the hyperreality of the machine, where signs and symbols replace experience, to the harsh, entropic void of the human base. Even the camera work reflects this hierarchy. Within the simulation, the lens is fluid, kinetic, and defiant of gravity, whereas in Zion, the camera is handheld, claustrophobic, and frantic, suggesting that the truth is far more confining than the lie. The human element of the film is tethered to this transition through Neo's identity crisis. His journey is not about gaining power, but about the violent dismantling of his own ego. The film poses a terrifying epistemological question: if our personalities, skills, and desires are products of our environment, who are we when the environment is revealed to be a construct? Neo's transformation from Mr. Anderson, a man defined by his alienation, to the One is not a journey toward enlightenment, but a surrender to the necessity of the machine's own prophecy. The Oracle herself serves as the ultimate architect of this control, utilizing the choice as a tactical variable. She doesn't predict Neo's future, she engineers it by providing the specific, comforting narrative that he needs to justify his eventual sacrifice. Ultimately, the Matrix concludes not with the liberation of humanity, but with the temporary reconfiguration of the system. The final, iconic shot, Neo flying through a neon-lit, digital cityscape, is not a sign of total victory. It is a promise of intervention. By asserting his will over the simulation, Neo becomes an active component of the feedback loop rather than its destroyer. The film leaves us with the unsettling implication that the real world is just another layer of the design, and that the struggle for meaning is a cyclical trap. The power of the film lies in this unresolved conflict. It suggests that even when we pull the plug on the machine, we are still searching for the next, more comfortable myth to believe in. We are all Cyphers in our own way, bargaining with the darkness, hoping that the illusion we choose to inhabit is worth the price of our autonomy. The synthesis question. The consensus view of The Matrix characterizes it as a high-concept action film about a hero discovering that his mundane reality is a simulated prison. Yet, this interpretation is fundamentally incomplete. It frames the film as a story of liberation, when in reality, The Matrix is a cold, mechanistic examination of how systems of control utilize the narrative of the chosen one to stabilize and iterate upon their own survival. The film's most jarring anomaly, the Oracle's calculated manipulation of Neo's belief in his own destiny, serves as the physical proof of this subversion. When the Oracle tells Neo he is not the one, she is not merely delivering a prophecy, she is calibrating his psychological state to ensure he makes the exact choices necessary to reboot the system. Thus, the synthesis of the film's philosophy, sociology, and visual craft reveals a harrowing truth: The Matrix is not a story about escaping the machine, but a record of the machine perfecting its own management of human rebellion. From a sociological perspective, The Matrix functions as a closed-loop economy where the currency is human cognitive dissonance. The system does not merely repress, it requires a controlled release valve, the resistance, to prevent total collapse. By providing a prophecy of salvation, the machines commodify the human instinct for rebellion, transforming potential revolutionary energy into a predictable data point. Psychologically, Neo is not a savior, but a trauma victim whose search for identity is exploited by the very architecture he seeks to dismantle. His awakening is not an expansion of consciousness, but a transition from one layer of scripted behavior to another, where his subjective experience of heroism is merely the emotional fuel powering the simulation's latest update. Philosophically, this places the film in a deterministic feedback loop. If the Oracle knows the outcome of every choice, agency is reduced to a comforting illusion. The anomaly of Neo's existence is not a glitch that the system fails to contain, but a necessary systemic upgrade, a feature, not a bug. The moral framework of the film, often viewed through the lens of Gnosticism or Cartesian doubt, actually aligns with a form of cybernetic fatalism. The protagonist's belief that he is breaking free is the exact mechanism by which he secures the machine's dominance. The visual execution reinforces this synthesis through the film's rigid spatial language. The persistent use of green-tinted filters within the simulation versus the cold, desaturated blues of the real world suggests an objective difference in truth. However, the production design, specifically the way the sleek, corporate aesthetics of the Matrix mirror the claustrophobic, repurposed machinery of the Nebuchadnezzar, hints that both environments are mere variations of containment. The iconic bullet time effect, while celebrated for its technical innovation, acts as the ultimate visual metaphor for this thesis. By freezing time and rotating the camera around a hero who has supposedly transcended the laws of physics, the film forces the viewer to admire the geometry of his confinement. The shot is technically breathtaking, yet philosophically isolating. It captures the hero not in a moment of liberation, but in a state of suspended animation, trapped within the aesthetic requirements of his own myth. The film's legacy is often tied to its aesthetic influence, but its true power lies in its unresolved conflict. In the final moments, when Neo addresses the machines with a promise to show humanity a world without rules or controls, he is speaking from within a power structure that has already factored his rhetoric into its next iteration. The film does not offer a path to genuine freedom, it offers a transition from the illusion of normalcy to the illusion of rebellion. Because the system survives the end of the narrative, the viewer is left in the same cycle the protagonist began in, believing they have witnessed a revolution, when they have actually witnessed the system's most efficient method of self-preservation. The Matrix is not a story of a hero winning, it is a clinical observation of how a system learns to survive its own opposition, proving that in a perfectly simulated reality, the only way to remain a cog is to believe you are the one destined to break the machine. Part 2. Context and world building. Systems, scarcity, and capital. The Matrix is frequently categorized as a cautionary tale about the dangers of artificial intelligence or a high-concept action spectacle. Yet, this consensus misses the film's fundamental characterization as an indictment of the parasitic relationship between capital and human essence. The film posits that our reality is not merely a simulation, but a labor-extractive system where the commodity is not the body, but the bioelectrical energy produced by the very act of living. By framing the Matrix as an economic engine, the Wachowskis subvert the classic man versus machine trope into a critique of how systems of control commodify human cognition and biological utility to maintain their own structural integrity. At the heart of this reality is an extreme form of energy-based capital. The machines have moved beyond the need for human thought or creativity, reducing humanity to a raw biological battery. This reveals a chilling truth about the film's power structure. In this world, consciousness is a secondary, perhaps even obstructive, byproduct of labor. The monopoly on this currency, human bioelectricity, is held by the machines, with control visualized through the sterile, ubiquitous green tint of the Matrix. This color palette acts as a visual ledger, a digital currency stamp that denotes state-sanctioned reality. Outside of this, the real world is a monochromatic wasteland of rusted iron and subterranean gloom, a physical manifestation of what remains when the system finishes consuming its subjects. The existence of a black market, represented by figures like Tank, Dozer, and the illicit data trading of Trinity, highlights exactly what the simulated society lacks: genuine, unmediated risk. In the Matrix, safety is the primary product sold to the populace. The black market serves to bypass the system's gatekeeping of reality, trading in knowledge, autonomy, and the dangerous, scavenged hardware required to perceive the truth. This mirrors the struggle against technological hegemony. Those within the system possess sleek, effortless technology that blinds them, while the rebels are forced to survive on obsolete tech, the rusted ships and jagged CRT monitors of the Nebuchadnezzar, which represents the raw, painful cost of awareness. Before Neo is unplugged, we see his normal Tuesday, a life of drab cubicles, monotonous transit, and the crushing weight of social conformity. The Matrix does not just enslave humans, it keeps them in a state of perpetual, low-grade boredom, which acts as the perfect anesthetic for exploitation. This baseline misery is essential. It renders the real world's harshness not as a loss, but as a liberation. The film forces us to confront the fact that in a late-stage capitalist model, comfort is often the most effective tool of subjugation. By trading a pleasant lie for a harsh truth, Neo rejects the commodification of his own life. This rejection is not merely a philosophical awakening but a labor dispute on an existential scale. The machines treat humans as literal infrastructure, cogs in an enormous, automated processing plant. When Morpheus speaks of the human body as a battery, he is describing the ultimate endgame of extractive capitalism, a world where the worker is no longer even needed to perform tasks, only to provide the biological heat that keeps the machine servers cool. The film's most poignant imagery is not the kung fu, but the fields of pods, the factory floor of the soul. Here, the production of reality is the system's primary export, and any individual who realizes they are the fuel rather than the beneficiary of this system becomes an anomaly, a threat to the market's stability. Ultimately, the Matrix argues that to exist within the system is to be an asset for someone else's gain. Neo's journey from a cog, an underpaid, directionless programmer, to the one is the process of reclaiming his own labor and agency. The film asks us to consider whether our modern, hypermediated lives are simply a more sophisticated version of the pod, where our data, attention, and energy are harvested to feed a machine that has long since ceased to serve human needs. By the time Neo breaks free, he has not just escaped a simulation, he has successfully declared himself a sovereign entity, refusing to be defined or fueled by the economic architecture of his oppressors. This is the enduring legacy of the film, the realization that the system is only as powerful as our willingness to provide it with our energy, and that the first act of revolution is simply to stop being a battery. Architecture and the visual geography. The Matrix posits itself as a high-octane liberation narrative, yet its enduring power lies in its function as a cautionary architecture of control. While the popular consensus views the film as a rebellion against a digital simulation, a deeper analysis reveals an indictment of the modern world as a closed-loop system where physical reality is subordinate to the convenience of the algorithm. The film's visual geography operates on a rigid duality, the green-tinted, sterile geometry of the simulation versus the rusted, claustrophobic industrialism of the desert of the Real. This architecture is not merely a backdrop but a physical manifestation of power, where the rich or the ruling machines occupy high-altitude, corporate, and frictionless spaces, while the laboring humanity, the human batteries, are literally buried in subterranean, pulsating organic pods. The film meticulously differentiates these spaces through the lens of entropy. Inside the Matrix, the world is a portrait of a society at its sleek, capitalist prime, governed by the illusion of progress and the relentless flow of information. Characters navigate these spaces via wide, clean lines and predictable urban transit, reflecting the baseline normal of a 1990s existence that assumes the stability of the physical world. However, the production design highlights the artificiality of this stability through monochromatic color grading. The pervasive green tint acts as a visual filter of decay, reminding the audience that this golden age is a digital construct, a hollow shell masquerading as life. In contrast, the real world of the Nebuchadnezzar and Zion is defined by radical decay. Here, humanity lives in the rusted-out ruins of a past civilization, utilizing scavenged, archaic technology to survive. This inversion of power, where the masters live in the clean heights of the digital cloud and the subjects rot in the dirty subterranean depths, perfectly mirrors the film's central thesis regarding the commodification of human consciousness. The geography of navigation within the Matrix is purposefully frictionless, designed to keep the individual moving in prescribed, repetitive paths. When Neo navigates the city, he does so through corporate lobbies and dense, crowded urban corridors that reinforce his insignificance against the vast, procedural architecture of the machine. The VFX of scale are employed to maximize this sense of vertigo. By using massive set extensions and digital cityscapes, the film makes the individual feel microscopic. This is the visual embodiment of the system's primary goal, the erasure of the singular ego in favor of the collective, mindless consumption of the digital dream. The architecture of the real world, meanwhile, is defined by visceral, organic clutter. The interiors of the ship are cramped and tactile, contrasting sharply with the simulated environments. While the Matrix uses light to suggest infinite, artificial openness, the real world uses shadows and tight framing to suggest that truth is found only in the intimate, unmediated connection between bodies. The anomaly of the film, the moment Neo realizes he can bend the laws of the simulated architecture, is not just an action beat, it is a fundamental rejection of the system's spatial authority. By warping the geometry of the simulation, Neo proves that the reality they have been sold is a malleable prison. Ultimately, the film argues that this structural hierarchy is inescapable as long as one accepts the validity of the simulation's architecture. The machines provide a perfectly engineered, aesthetically consistent reality because it is the most efficient way to manage human livestock. The tragedy and the triumph of the film exist in the friction between the two worlds, the desire to remain in the sleek, clean, and false versus the imperative to exist in the broken, dark, and true. By grounding its philosophy in this architectural starkness, The Matrix moves beyond simple sci-fi spectacle to suggest that our environment is the primary apparatus of our ideological control, and that true liberation requires not just fighting the system, but recognizing the artifice of the walls we choose to live within. Epistemology, information, and society. The enduring legacy of The Matrix is often reduced to its aesthetic contributions, the leather-clad iconography and the innovation of bullet time. Yet, the film's true brilliance lies in its ruthless deconstruction of epistemological security. To perceive The Matrix merely as a high-octane action film about a digital rebellion is to miss its foundational argument, that human reality is a consensually validated fiction maintained by a totalizing propaganda engine. The film posits that our perception of the real is less an objective truth and more an interface, a curated data stream designed to pacify the human psyche while commodifying its biological energy. Within the simulated world, the ruling class, represented by the sentient programs of the Matrix, utilizes an insidious epistemic architecture to keep humanity in a state of terminal comfort. This propaganda engine does not merely lie, it constructs a hypernormal reality that accounts for the trivialities of daily life, effectively drowning the populace in noise to prevent them from seeking that signal. The simulation is a masterclass in social engineering, relying on the Baudrillardian concept that the map has become the territory. For the average citizen, truth is defined by consensus. If every interface, architectural landmark, and social interaction aligns with the programmed baseline, the simulation becomes indistinguishable from reality. The film's brilliant visual shorthand, the pervasive, sickly green tint applied to scenes within the simulation, acts as a subconscious cue to the viewer, signaling that this is not merely a different setting, but a chemically and digitally mediated prison. The contrast between this synthetic gloss and the subterranean reality of Zion is the film's most powerful analytical tool. In Zion, the last refuge of humanity, the environment is defined by entropy, decay, and scarcity. While The Matrix is a frictionless corporate dream, the real world is a rusted, visceral nightmare. This geographical hierarchy serves as a metaphor for the cost of true knowledge. To know the truth is to lose the comfort of the illusion. The characters who awaken are, by definition, the outgroups and exiles. They exist in the physical cracks of a world that has been hollowed out by technological progress. Their labor is no longer productive in a capitalist sense, but disruptive. They are human anomalies attempting to reclaim the subjective experience of consciousness from a system that treats them as mere battery cells. Epistemologically, the characters are forced to bridge the gap between their sensory data and the terrifying, cold logic of the machine world. This creates a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. When Neo is first pulled from the pod, his trauma is not just psychological, it is somatic. The residual self-image he carries acts as a vestigial projection of his internal identity onto a digital canvas. The film suggests that even when liberated, humans are incapable of discarding the narrative frames they have been programmed with, as evidenced by the crew of the Nebuchadnezzar retaining their names, fashion, and social hierarchies. The machine has already won the war of language. Even in rebellion, the human participants speak in terms of programs, ports, and uploads, constrained by the very digital vocabulary used to enslave them. The antagonist, Agent Smith, serves as the ultimate arbiter of this epistemic closure. His logic is perfectly calibrated to the machine's worldview. He views humanity as a virus because we are the only organisms that refuse to exist in equilibrium with our environment. From his perspective, the Matrix is the only rational solution to the chaos of human nature. This mirror image dynamic highlights the film's central irony. The machines are actually the ones championing order and stability, while the humans represent the messy, destructive, and beautiful potential of unmitigated free will. The conflict is not merely a war for survival, but a collision between two incompatible philosophies of existence. Ultimately, the Matrix suggests that we are all trapped in a feedback loop of our own making, where our desire for normalcies makes us complicit in our own domestication. The film's refusal to provide a definitive, utopian ending is its most honest moment. When Neo begins to rewrite the code of the simulation at the climax, he does not destroy the system, he merely gains the agency to manipulate it. This realization, that freedom is not the absence of a system, but the ability to see the seams and choose to act regardless, is the core takeaway. The legacy of the film is not found in its influence on visual effects, but in its persistent, haunting question: how much of your own world is built on the convenience of an illusion, and are you brave enough to trade that certainty for the jagged, uncomfortable edges of the truth? The film leaves us in a state of perpetual, anxious inquiry, challenging the viewer to dismantle the propagandistic architecture of their own daily life. Friction, law, and the catalyst. The consensus surrounding the Matrix often reduces it to a high-octane spectacle of cyberpunk rebellion, a narrative of the chosen one liberating humanity from a digital prison. Yet, this reading ignores the film's more biting critique of late-stage capitalism and the commodification of human consciousness. If the consensus suggests the film is about freedom from machines, the subversion reveals it is actually a diagnostic of how modern systems turn individual identity into a replicable, extractable resource. The synthesis of this argument lies in the convergence of the film's industrial aesthetic and its Gnostic philosophy. The machines are not merely antagonists, they are the ultimate expression of a world where existence is predicated on productivity, and rebellion is merely a glitch in the software that the system eventually learns to patch. The world building of the Matrix rests on the fundamental scarcity of truth in a hyper-capitalist simulation. The film presents two disparate realities: the sleek, corporate-sponsored green hue of the Matrix, representing the sanitized facade of consumerist stability, and the rusted, claustrophobic industrialism of the real world. In the Matrix, the currency is the normalcy of a mid-90s cubicle existence, where Neo is a cog in a software corporation. This represents the ultimate commodification of labor. Humans are not just workers, but literal biological batteries, their very bioelectricity harvested by the state-corporate hybrid of the machine city. The film posits that corporate power has entirely eclipsed human agency. The laws of physics themselves are subject to the proprietary code of a synthetic authority. The friction within this system is generated by the anomaly, the emergence of the One. Neo is not merely a hero, he is a destabilizing variable in a mathematical equation. His transition from a restless, alienated hacker to the savior of Zion is a response to the systemic collapse of his internal reality. This epistemic fracture occurs at the moment of the red pill, where his fundamental understanding of reality is shattered. Here, the film employs the concept of the technological tipping point. The system is collapsing inward, not due to external force, but because it has grown too complex to sustain its own illusions. The machines, as the arbiters of truth, use the Matrix to manage human consciousness as a resource, ensuring that the outgroups, those who cannot assimilate, are physically and socially segregated into the subterranean ruins of Zion. The human element is defined by the tension between somatic memory and digital projection. Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity exist in a state of cognitive dissonance, where their trauma, the memory of their own birth from pods, is stored in their bodies as a persistent, phantom sensation. The film's visual language reinforces this. Characters are often framed against massive, indifferent digital backdrops or trapped within the narrow, sterile corridors of high-rise offices, emphasizing their insignificance against the machine architecture. When Neo eventually sees the Matrix, the visual shift from a literal world to a cascading stream of green code marks the death of his ego. He realizes that his previous identity, his job, his apartment, his name, was merely a fabricated user interface designed to keep his mind docile. Philosophically, the film acts as a rejection of the comfort of ignorance. It frames the trolley problem of the blue versus red pill not as a choice of safety versus danger, but as a moral indictment of a life lived in a consensual hallucination. The film argues for an existential revolt. Even if the real world is a desolate, scorched wasteland, it is superior to the most comfortable simulation because it is true. The machines, conversely, operate on a cold, utilitarian morality. Agent Smith's hatred for humanity stems from his observation that we do not exist in equilibrium with our environment, but rather consume until we have destroyed the resource, a mirror held up to the audience's own environmental and social behaviors. Technically, the film's innovation, the bullet time effect, is not merely a stylistic flourish, it is the visual representation of agency. By slowing down time, Neo literally bends the rules of the simulation, claiming power over the system's own physics. The integration of practical stunt work with pioneering VFX creates an uncanny valley where the audience is forced to question the authenticity of every frame. The audio environment, dominated by the mechanical hum of machinery and the sharp, piercing metallic sounds of the Sentinels, contrasts with the muted, artificial stillness of the Matrix, keeping the viewer in a state of sensory hyper-awareness. Ultimately, the Matrix does not offer a clean resolution. The system is too vast to be destroyed in a single act of defiance. The final synthesis reveals that the struggle for authenticity is an ongoing process of negotiation with the systems that define us. The recursive loop of the film, ending where it began, but with the protagonist now capable of manipulating the fabric of his world, suggests that the revolution is not in the destruction of the machine, but in the individual's refusal to be defined by it. The legacy of the film persists because it accurately identified our modern anxiety, that we are living in a world of high-definition simulations, where the only thing left of actual value is the ability to choose, however painfully, to see the truth. Part 3. The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The epistemic fracture of the Matrix is not a singular moment of awakening, but a protracted, violent disintegration of the self that culminates precisely when Thomas Anderson is forced to confront the digital artifice of his own body. While the red pill represents the choice to pursue truth, the actual fracture occurs when Neo survives the simulated fall, only to wake up in a gelatinous pod, a visceral, biological tomb. This timestamp marks the death of the hacker identity and the birth of a traumatized survivor who discovers that his reality was never merely a misunderstanding, but a systematic, agricultural extraction of his own consciousness. His reaction is marked not by immediate heroism, but by a somatic rejection of this new, terrifying truth. He hyperventilates and vomits, a physiological manifestation of his psyche failing to integrate the horror of his true material existence. This trauma is compounded by the profound limits of language within the film's universe. Characters like Cypher and Neo are, for much of the film, confined by the vocabulary of the simulation. Cypher's betrayal, for instance, is rooted in the realization that he lacks the language to articulate the agony of the real to his peers, leading him to choose the comfortable, albeit false, language of the stake and the velvet of the Matrix. He cannot voice his desire for ignorance, so he acts it out through nihilistic violence. Similarly, Neo's internal life is defined by a deep, resonant silence. In the corporate office of Metacortex, his silence is a performative act of compliance. Later, as he trains in the construct, his silence reflects the exhaustion of a mind trying to map a world that defies Newtonian physics. He is haunted by a splinter in his mind that he cannot name until Morpheus provides the framework, confirming that for these characters, the ability to name their reality is the first step toward reclaiming agency. The cognitive dissonance within the film's narrative is most strikingly exemplified by Morpheus himself. As a mentor, he preaches the necessity of freedom and the sanctity of the human spirit, yet he subjects Neo to a rigid, often brutal regimen of conditioning that mirrors the very determinism they claim to fight. he justifies the loss of human life in the process of waking up others through a utilitarian moral calculus, a cold, almost machine-like necessity that creates a contradiction between his humanist rhetoric and his tactical actions. This dissonance is the engine of the film. Morpheus, like the machines, believes he knows the one when he sees him, effectively turning human potential into a predictive algorithm that he desperately hopes will validate his own life's work. This struggle is further obscured by the fabricated ego that Neo clings to in the first act, that of the solitary, alienated genius. He tells himself he is a man apart, a disaffected wanderer searching for the source of his discontent. This chosen one mythology is the ultimate trap, a narrative construct designed to keep him searching for a destination rather than realizing that his identity is a fluid, programmable variable. When the facade of the good citizen Thomas Anderson finally shatters, it reveals that he was never an individual at all, but a commodity in a vast, closed-loop system. The film argues that until a character moves beyond the comfort of these inherited labels, hacker, soldier, savior, they remain in the thrall of the simulation, forever repeating the traumas of their predecessors. The true human element of the Matrix is not the ability to dodge bullets or bend the code, but the agonizing realization that the self is an architecture, one that must be dismantled entirely before it can be rebuilt in the image of something truly free. Trauma and somatic experiencing. At the center of the Matrix lies a profound exploration of the human element, specifically how trauma and somatic memory define the transition from a fabricated existence to a liberated reality. For Neo, the core wound is not merely the realization that his life is a lie, but the ontological shattering of his own identity. The film masterfully obscures this trauma in the first two acts, framing his journey as a typical hero's quest or a technological awakening, while keeping the true source of his suffering, the profound alienation of a life lived as a commodity, locked beneath the surface. It is only in the third act, through his death and subsequent rebirth, that we understand his foundational trauma. He has been a corpse his entire life, fueling the very system he sought to escape. This reveal retroactively colors every moment of his initial hesitation and profound sense of disconnection, transforming his earlier detachment into a logical symptom of a soul recognizing its own commodification. Somatic memory serves as the physical language of this trauma, manifesting in the way Neo relates to his body. Before he is unplugged, he lives in a state of dissociative anxiety, his body acting as a prison that feels fundamentally misaligned with his consciousness. The glitches he perceives, the heavy sense of unease and the feeling that something is missing, are somatic signals that his physical form is being tethered to a digital construct. Once he enters the real world, this relationship shifts toward the visceral. The holes in his body, left by the pods and cables of the machines, are the literal sites of his trauma, remaining as raw, physical scars. When he is plugged into the construct to learn, the pain is not just mental data, it is an assault on his nervous system. His body remembers the agony of being a resource, which is why his initial training, the feeling of sore muscles that Morpheus points out, is so critical. It is the first time Neo experiences the physical consequences of his own labor, confirming that his body is no longer just a projection, but a temple he must reclaim from the system. This reclamation is marked by a clear struggle between flesh and augmentation. Within the Matrix, Neo treats his body as upgradable hardware, pushing his avatar toward godhood to achieve control. However, in the real world, his body is fragile, malnourished, and fundamentally organic. The film avoids the trap of glorifying technological transcendence. Instead, it posits that true liberation requires acknowledging the limitations of one's flesh. Neo's coping mechanism, initially characterized by avoidant dissociation, evolves into a fierce, embodied presence. Where he once checked out of his reality, he begins to hack it by grounding himself in the visceral sensory experience of the moment. This is a rejection of the system's desire for his total integration. By becoming fully present in his human form, he renders himself uncomputable to the machine's deterministic logic. The film further explores this through repetition compulsion, as Neo constantly finds himself drawn back into simulated combat scenarios. By repeatedly subjecting himself to the violence of the training programs, he is not merely practicing skills, he is reenacting his own traumatic awakening under controlled circumstances. He is attempting to master the very trauma that once rendered him powerless. This culminates in his final confrontation with Agent Smith, where the miracle of his survival is not a digital cheat code, but the result of a radical somatic shift. When he stops trying to do kung fu and instead knows that his body is an extension of his consciousness, he dissolves the boundary between the ego and the simulated space. The film's brilliant final realization is that the trauma of the machine world is only absolute if one accepts the body as a commodity. By choosing to occupy his skin fully, whether in the simulation or the wreckage of the real world, Neo transforms the somatic memory of his slavery into the tool of his liberation, proving that the human element is the one variable the machine system can never accurately simulate. The shadow and the antagonist. The antagonism in The Matrix is rarely framed as a battle between good and evil, but rather as an epistemic clash between two competing models of order. Agent Smith functions as the definitive Jungian shadow to Neo, representing not just the system's iron fist, but the terrifying potential for absolute, static nihilism. Smith is the literal manifestation of Neo's repressed fears, the fear of being a machine, the fear of being disposable, and the fear that individual consciousness is nothing more than a glitch in an otherwise perfect, deterministic equation. Where Neo struggles with the messy, unstable nature of human intuition and belief, Smith achieves his terrifying efficacy through a total surrender to the logic of the system. From an epistemological standpoint, Smith is perhaps the most honest character in the film. He makes no attempt to justify his existence through human morality. Instead, he views the world as a pure thermodynamic problem that requires constant balancing. His hatred of humanity, which he defines as a virus, is entirely logical within his framework of the Matrix. If the purpose of the simulated reality is to provide a stable, controlled environment for the harvest of human bioelectricity, then human unpredictability is indeed an infection. Smith is a pragmatist stripped of sentimentality, and his villainy stems from his refusal to accept that a system lacking spirit or agency is inherently hollow. He is the personification of the blue pill taken to its absolute, cold conclusion: the comfort of the machine is superior to the agony of the real. Cypher, however, serves as the film's essential mirror character, acting as the tragic counterpoint to Neo's awakening. If Neo represents the potential for transcendence, Cypher represents the inevitable retreat into regression. Placed in the same position of having seen the desert of the real, Cypher rejects the heroic burden of choice in favor of a comfortable, simulated lie. His betrayal is not born of mere malice, but of a profound, articulated cowardice. He is the cautionary tale of what happens when the weight of truth proves too heavy for the human psyche. Cypher's choice, to trade the struggle for consciousness for the sensory pleasure of a synthetic steak, highlights the exact psychological boundary that Neo must cross. By choosing to return to the simulation, Cypher proves that the primary conflict of the film is not fought in the streets, but within the individual's capacity to tolerate the absence of certainty. This tension is further reflected in the parasitic versus symbiotic dynamics that define the crew of the Nebuchadnezzar. While Smith represents a parasitic system that feeds on the body heat of a lobotomized species, the relationship between Morpheus and Neo is designed to be a risky, symbiotic transfer of purpose. Morpheus is not a savior, but a catalyst who projects his own messianic expectations onto Neo. This creates a volatile psychological feedback loop. Neo is plagued by the fear that he is not the one, yet he is forced to embody that role to satisfy the collective hope of the survivors. He projects his insecurity onto his allies, constantly questioning his own worthiness and the validity of Morpheus's prophecy. Ultimately, the confrontation between Neo and Smith is a battle over the definition of the self. Smith represents the static, immutable ego, a rigid structure that cannot evolve or grow. Neo represents the fluid, evolving self, an entity that is willing to break, rewrite, and eventually transcend its own nature. When Neo finally realizes that his power is not a function of the system's rules but a rejection of them, he is forced to confront the fact that his shadow is a necessary part of his development. Smith is the prison, but he is also the metric by which Neo measures his freedom. By the final act, the antagonism has shifted from an external threat to an internal requirement. Neo can only fully realize his identity by integrating the lessons of the machine and surpassing the constraints of the programmer. The tragedy of the antagonist is that he is forever trapped in the cycle of his own logic, while the triumph of the protagonist is found in the terrifying, chaotic freedom of the unknown. The visual proof of the psyche. The human element in the Matrix serves as a bridge between the clinical rigidity of the simulation and the volatile, messy reality of the resistance. The film functions as an exploration of the psyche trapped within a digital panopticon, where the visual language of isolation is not merely a stylistic choice but a fundamental tool of containment. Early in the narrative, Thomas Anderson is perpetually framed through barriers, windows, reflective monitors, and the claustrophobic cubicle walls of his office, which physically delineate his alienation. He is a man rendered microscopic by his environment, dwarfed by the massive, sterile cityscapes that signify his insignificance within the systemic machine. This visual isolation is amplified by the contrast between the saturated, sickly green hue of the Matrix and the desaturated, industrial blue of the real world. In both, the protagonist is effectively a captive of his own perceived limitations. The uncanny valley of the soul manifests most acutely in the film's depiction of Agent Smith. While he appears human, his movements are characterized by a chilling, rhythmic efficiency that highlights his lack of interiority. Unlike Neo, who stumbles through his early awakening, Smith is fixed, precise, and devoid of the erratic human impulses, doubt, fear, or hesitation that ultimately define the human struggle. This dichotomy forces the audience to confront a central psychological question: at what point does a programmed life become indistinguishable from a lived one? The characters who remain plugged in exhibit a performative stability in public, their interactions governed by the social scripts of the simulation. Conversely, in the intimate, dark quarters of the Nebuchadnezzar, the crew's behavior is raw and vulnerable. They are stripped of the corporate self, often appearing tired, unkempt, and physically grounded in the rusted machinery of their reality. Their vulnerability is a form of resistance, a refusal to perform the seamless, optimized persona demanded by the Matrix. Trauma serves as the bedrock of Neo's arc, and the film masterfully uses diegetic triggers to force the character into the realization of his fractured ego. The recurring, glitchy static and the sound of a telephone ringing serve as visceral cues that pierce his dissociation. These are not merely plot devices, they are somatic reminders of a reality he has tried to suppress. Neo's physical transition from the simulated Thomas Anderson, a man of soft posture and avoidant habits, to the lean, hardened Neo illustrates the shedding of a false identity. His trauma is not discarded, it is recontextualized. He moves from being a prisoner of a memory he cannot name to being an architect of his own liberation. The breaking point for this ego destruction arrives during the final confrontation, where Neo is forced to discard the messianic label Morpheus projected onto him. When he is ultimately killed by Agent Smith, the facade of the Chosen One is fully incinerated. The visual image of his body slumped in the chair, coupled with the camera's slow, deliberate focus on the reality of his human mortality, signifies the death of his old, ego-driven self. It is only in this moment of total annihilation, when he is no longer Thomas, the hacker, or Neo, the savior, that he can truly integrate the system. He ceases to view the code as an external force and begins to perceive it as an extension of his own cognition. By embracing the void where his identity once lived, he achieves a state of agency that transcends his programming. This synthesis of the internal, traumatized human and the external, infinite digital architecture completes the film's argument: human consciousness is not something to be contained, but something that, when faced with the absolute failure of its own reality, will instinctively expand to reconstruct the world in its own image. The human element, therefore, is not the weakness the machines believe it to be, but the only variable that makes the universe fundamentally unpredictable and, by extension, free. Part 4: Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. The philosophical core of the Matrix rests on the uncomfortable intersection of Cartesian skepticism and the linguistic limitations of perceived reality. At its most fundamental level, the film serves as a cinematic vessel for the classic brain-in-a-vat thought experiment, positing that sensory input is an unreliable metric for truth. However, the film elevates this beyond simple doubt by questioning the nature of the language used to construct that reality. If we operate under the Wittgensteinian premise that the limits of our language define the limits of our world, then the Matrix is not merely a simulation, it is a closed linguistic system. The machines do not just feed the popular simulated calories, they restrict the vocabulary of human existence to the mundane, the corporate, and the predictable. By confining the human mind to the parameters of 1999, the system prevents the consciousness from conceptualizing any outside that might threaten the stability of the simulation. Within this framework, truth is not an objective fact, it is a proprietary asset managed by the machines. The film presents the agent as the ultimate epistemic authority, a figure who literally possesses the power to rewrite the rules of discourse. When an agent speaks, reality conforms. When an individual dares to perceive an anomaly, the agent, as an arbiter of the state's truth, represses that perception through violence or erasure. The citizenry, trapped in a post-truth state of their own making, is not necessarily drowning in data, but rather suffering from a systemic starvation of context. They exist in a recursive loop where their interactions with the world are mediated entirely by digital interfaces, ensuring that the concept of an objective, independent reality becomes an impossible abstraction for the average inhabitant. The film leans heavily into the Cartesian assertion that sensory experience is fundamentally deceptive. The iconic red pill, the blue pill, the dichotomy is not just a choice of outcomes, but a choice of epistemic paths, the comfort of a consistent, simulated sensation versus the jarring, often painful exposure to an objective, cold reality. This creates a fascinating tension regarding the nature of the real. Once Neo leaves the Matrix, he is faced with a world that is objectively more difficult and physically impoverished than the simulation. The film asks whether truth possesses an inherent, aesthetic, or moral value if it is fundamentally less pleasurable or ordered than the lie. Here, the struggle to wake up is a radical act of linguistic and conceptual rebellion. To see the world as it truly is, one must reject the vocabulary of the system and learn to speak the language of the resistance, which is defined by fluidity, abstraction, and the defiance of programmed laws. Ultimately, the Matrix suggests that knowledge is not something to be discovered, but something to be seized through the destruction of existing, false frameworks. The characters who inhabit the Nebuchadnezzar represent the transition from passive subjects of a simulated discourse to active participants in an existential one. They are constantly confronted with the limits of their own understanding, forced to realize that their perceived self was largely a byproduct of their environment. By the time Neo achieves his final realization, the film has successfully argued that the truth is not found in the sensory confirmation of the physical world, but in the radical, subjective decision to exist independently of the propaganda engine. The Matrix's greatest triumph is not its visual depiction of digital collapse, but its quiet, persistent insistence that our current consensus reality is merely a linguistic agreement, one that can be shattered by a mind brave enough to ask what happens when the language of the simulation no longer applies to the human experience. Metanarratives and social theory. The Matrix is often categorized as a quintessential action film defined by bullet time and existential high-concept sci-fi, a perspective that positions it primarily as a spectacle of rebellion against a digital dystopia. However, this interpretation is incomplete. The film is more accurately an interrogation of the Baudrillardian collapse of the real, where the simulation is not merely a prison but a totalizing hyperreality that has rendered the physical world obsolete. The core philosophical tension is not simply between humans and machines, but between the comforting myth of the grand narrative, be it religious messianism, capitalist individualism, or humanist progress, and the sterile, entropic reality of a post-human existence. Before the protagonist, Neo, is unplugged, he exists within a simulation that mirrors the late 90s capitalist reality. This is not just a backdrop, it is an ideological state apparatus, ISA. The Matrix utilizes the familiar aesthetics of corporate bureaucracy, urban transit, and media consumption to stabilize the human psyche. The ruling machines do not rely solely on the physical harvesting of energy, they require the psychological alignment of the subject to the system. By presenting the illusion of a world governed by cause, effect, and the promise of upward mobility, the system prevents the human mind from recognizing the inherent absurdity of its condition. When Neo navigates his normal life as a software engineer and hacker, he is participating in a dual cycle. His labor contributes to the corporate machine, while his illicit activities on the fringes of the web serve as a controlled release, a commodification of rebellion that the system effectively manages until he becomes a threat that must be integrated or liquidated. The film's brilliance lies in its refusal to offer a clean exit from this structure. As Neo transitions from the simulation into the desert of the real, he confronts the total failure of humanism. The Zion Underground, while organic, is a place of scarcity, decay, and tactical desperation. It reveals that the machines are not just enemies but manifestations of humanity's own technological trajectory. The machines, in their pursuit of optimal efficiency, represent the ultimate logical endpoint of human organizational theory. The conflict between the Matrix and the human resistance is a cybernetic feedback loop. The prophecy of the One, which gives the humans hope, is itself a construct designed by the system to manage the inevitable iterations of the resistance. The characters are trapped in a loop where their attempts to achieve liberation are the very mechanisms by which the system maintains its long-term stability. This systemic determinism challenges the viewer to reconsider the ethics of ignorance. Is the blue pill truly a cage, or is it a mercy? In a hyper-connected, hyper-mediated world where symbols have replaced physical interaction, the truth, the red pill, is not a liberatory end state but an invitation to suffer. The Matrix functions as a mirror for our own reality, where digital information increasingly dictates the limits of our social world. The film suggests that we are all, to varying degrees, living within these constructed boundaries, where the truth is merely the consensus view provided by the dominant architecture of information. Technically, the film's visual language reinforces this philosophical weight. The stark distinction between the green-tinted, digital color palette of the Matrix and the desaturated, metallic blues of the real world serves as a persistent reminder that the senses are being manipulated. When the frame is tight, claustrophobic, and filled with digital noise, it reflects the protagonist's inability to process his trauma within the confines of his programmed reality. The eventual shift in Neo's perspective, where he begins to see the world as raw code, signifies the final destruction of his fabricated ego. He is no longer a human interacting with a world, he is an agent of change capable of rewriting the underlying logic of the environment. Ultimately, the film leaves us with an unresolved conflict. Neo does not destroy the machines, nor does he free humanity in any literal sense. Instead, he asserts the validity of his own agency in an environment that mandates his submission. The legacy of the Matrix is not in the defeat of a villain, but in the radical, existential assertion that the individual's perception is a sovereign territory that must be defended against the encroachments of technological and societal narratives. Even as the final frames suggest an open-ended hope, the film leaves the viewer with the unsettling realization that their own reality is a construct, and the only path toward true autonomy is the constant, often painful, recognition of the limits of one's own perception. The struggle is not to escape the system, but to recognize it as a construct and refuse to be a passive participant in its ongoing iteration. Ethics and the moral calculus. The ethical core of the Matrix is not merely found in the high-stakes combat of its protagonists, but in the harrowing moral calculus that underpins their survival. While the film is often read as an action-oriented liberation narrative, its deeper philosophical engine runs on a collision course between utilitarian necessity and the radical assertion of individual agency. The central ethical dilemma, most clearly distilled during Morphews's recruitment of Neo, frames existence as a choice between a comfortable, fabricated servitude and a perilous, awakening autonomy. This is the quintessential expression of the ethics of ignorance. The film posits that the blue pill, a life of pleasant, simulated delusion, is a moral failure of the self, even if it offers a painless reality. By rejecting the red pill, one effectively chooses to remain a battery, a passive component of a parasitic system, thereby forfeiting the right to genuine human experience. This shift toward truth forces the characters into a rigid, often brutal utilitarianism. The Zion resistance movement operates on a wartime moral footing where the survival of the species necessitates the sacrifice of the individual. When Morpheus declares that some rules can be bent while others can be broken, he is articulating a moral pragmatism that mirrors the very system he seeks to dismantle. The resistance must often abandon deontology, the idea that certain actions are inherently wrong regardless of consequences, to combat an enemy that recognizes no moral bounds. This brings the protagonist's moral code into a startling, uncomfortable proximity with that of the antagonists. To survive in the real world, Neo must become a weapon, engaging in the same cold, calculated violence as Agent Smith. The moral distinction between them is not found in their methodology, but in their intent. Smith's violence is the maintenance of a static, closed loop, whereas Neo's violence is the disruption of that loop in favor of the unknown. The film further complicates this ethics by interrogating the baseline requirements for personhood. The machines are presented as the ultimate other, and yet, the film forces the viewer to confront the logic of the antagonist. From the perspective of the sentient programs, they are not malicious oppressors, they are simply fulfilling their design parameters in an environment that requires energy for sustainability. This raises the question of whether the ability to suffer is the true indicator of moral rights. The humans in the Matrix do not know they are suffering, yet their subconscious mind experiences the trauma of the simulation. Conversely, the programs exhibit a form of consciousness that, by the conclusion of the story, mimics human emotion, jealousy, and purpose. The film leaves the audience in a state of moral ambiguity regarding the non-human, suggesting that the divide between human and artificial is as simulated as the reality the characters inhabit. Confronted with this realization, that the universe is a construct designed to extract value from them, the characters undergo what Camus would define as an absurd revolt. Faced with a world devoid of inherent, objective meaning, the characters do not succumb to nihilism. Instead, they embrace the absurdity of their condition. Neo's trajectory from a disaffected software developer to the One is the process of creating his own meaning within a system designed to strip him of it. His evolution is not about gaining power, but about gaining the agency to reject the predetermined path. In doing so, the film argues that the struggle itself is the defining human act. Whether or not Neo can truly defeat the Matrix is almost secondary to the fact that he chooses to revolt against its totalizing logic. This leads to the final, haunting conclusion of the film's moral calculus, the realization that the system's primary strength is not its ability to force compliance, but its ability to tempt the individual into choosing their own cage. By presenting the audience with the choice between the painful truth and the blissful lie, the Matrix denies the spectator the comfort of neutrality. It posits that the act of living in a world of illusion is an active moral choice, one that demands a reckoning with the self. When Neo eventually stares down the system, he is not merely fighting a digital construct, he is asserting that human value is defined by the capacity to see the bars of the cage and choose, regardless of the consequences, to attempt to break them. The film suggests that while we may live in a world where truth is mediated and controlled, the ethical obligation remains the same, to choose the discomfort of reality over the tyranny of a convenient, simulated peace. Determinism, agency, and time. The Matrix functions as a sophisticated interrogation of the tension between hard determinism and the radical assertion of human agency. At its core, the film explores whether the individual can ever truly escape the gravitational pull of a programmed reality, or if the revolutionary act itself is merely an anticipated variable within the system's own internal logic. The Wachowskis construct a world where choice is presented as the primary metric of liberation, yet they simultaneously litter the narrative with hints that Neo's path, the journey of the One, is a recurring, systemic necessity rather than a spontaneous evolution of human will. The paradox of the Oracle's prophesied lies at the heart of this conflict. By telling Neo exactly what he needs to hear to fulfill his role, the Oracle acts not as a seer of independent futures, but as an architect of self-fulfilling outcomes. Her guidance forces us to ask whether Neo chooses to save Morpheus because he has reached a state of enlightened autonomy, or because the simulation has pushed him into a corner where that specific choice is the only logical output to maintain the system's stability. This aligns with a structuralist view of the film. The system requires an anomaly to purge its own errors, and Neo's awakening is less a subversion of the machine and more a maintenance protocol. In this sense, the individual is not conquering the structure, they are serving as its periodic reset button. However, the film attempts to pivot toward existential hope through the character's reaction to this burden. When Cypher chooses to retreat into the blissful ignorance of the simulation, he represents the ultimate surrender to determinism, an embrace of the blue pill as a surrender of the painful weight of consciousness. Conversely, Neo's trajectory represents the terrifying, paralyzing reality of Sartre's dictum that we are condemned to be free. The burden of choice is depicted not as a glorious flight of fancy, but as a grueling, somatic struggle. When Neo faces the final confrontation with Agent Smith, his victory is not achieved through superior strength or preordained destiny, but through the visceral, irrational rejection of the system's rules. By seeing the simulation for what it is, mere code, he asserts a primacy of consciousness over structure. The film's synthesis of these ideas is found in the final, iconic moments of the first installment. As Neo flies toward the camera, he addresses the machines directly, promising to show the people a world without rules or controls, without borders or boundaries. Yet, the viewer is left with a lingering, unsettling question: if the Matrix is a simulation designed to contain the human spirit, does Neo's rebellion happen outside the machine, or is this liberation simply the next version of the software? The brilliance of the film lies in this refusal to provide a definitive answer. By ending on a note of active defiance rather than systemic collapse, the directors side with an existentialist interpretation of the hero's journey. Even if the struggle is ultimately a recursive loop, a cycle of birth, rebellion, and systemic assimilation, the value of the human experience is located entirely within the act of resistance itself. The struggle, however futile it may appear from a macroscopic, algorithmic perspective, becomes the definition of the self. Neo's choice to remain in the desert of the real is the ultimate, non-deterministic act of faith. He does not know if he will win, and he does not know if his freedom is genuine, but he chooses the agony of the truth over the comfort of the programmed lie. Ultimately, the Matrix suggests that agency is not an inherent state of being, but a constant, exhausting practice. The characters are not liberated by the act of waking up alone, they are liberated by the subsequent refusal to be re-assimilated into the comfort of the machine. The final synthesis is one of cautious, radical optimism. While the system is vast, structural, and seemingly inescapable, the decision to consciously exist, to feel, to suffer, and to fight against the inertia of one's own programming remains the only authentic claim to humanity. The machines may control the simulation, but they cannot simulate the unpredictable, defiant spark of an individual who has chosen to define themselves against the totality of their environment. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The visual language of the Matrix acts as the primary conduit for its philosophical argument, utilizing cinematography not merely to capture action, but to map the transition from existential ignorance to enlightened agency. The film's aesthetic strategy relies on a rigorous binary, defined primarily through its color palette architecture. Within the simulated world, the Wachowskis impose a sickly, jaundiced green tint, suggesting a reality that is decaying, synthesized, and processed, a digital sickness. Conversely, the world of the Nebuchadnezzar is bathed in cold, sterile blues and harsh, desaturated metallic tones. This shift in color temperature is more than a stylistic choice, it serves as a Pavlovian cue for the audience, reinforcing the distinction between the comfort of the fabricated dream and the brutal, entropic truth of the post-human landscape. The film's use of framing and camera movement further delineates this divide between the enslaved and the awakened. In The Matrix, the camera often adopts the perspective of an objective, omniscient observer, smooth, calculated, and predatory. When Agent Smith or his counterparts occupy the frame, the cinematography utilizes rigid, static compositions and precise dollies, emphasizing their nature as manifestations of an orderly, algorithmic system. The agents are frequently shot from low angles, reinforcing their dominance over the flickering, ephemeral human programs they police. In contrast, when Neo is still under the thrall of the simulation, the framing frequently traps him in claustrophobic, shallow-focus environments. He is often pressed against walls or obscured by the architectural geometry of his cubicle, visually manifesting his entrapment within a corporate panopticon. As Neo's awareness expands, the camera's behavior evolves. During his training sequences, the movement becomes more erratic, mirroring the psychological instability of a mind shedding its foundational biases. By the time Neo achieves his status as the One, the film's spatial language shifts into something transcendental. The bullet time sequences, a hallmark of the film's technical innovation, represent the ultimate convergence of camera movement and thematic revelation. By utilizing an array of cameras to freeze time while the vantage point circles the subject, the film creates a visual metaphor for the disruption of deterministic cause and effect. Neo is no longer a cog in the machine, he is a glitch in the code, a variable that moves at a different frequency than the programmed reality around him. The motif of light remains equally vital in reconciling the film's dual realities. In the simulation, light is directional, harsh, and artificial, often emanating from fluorescent sources that imply the presence of a server-side origin. It is a light that hides as much as it reveals, flattening textures and masking the underlying binary code. When Neo finally breaks free, the real world is defined by silhouettes, embers, and the dim, flickering luminescence of an abandoned Earth. This lighting is organic, unpredictable, and often insufficient, forcing the characters to navigate a world that provides no clarity or guidance. This spatial hierarchy serves the overarching thesis that the Matrix is a prison of perception. The cinematography ensures that even when characters are moving through the vast, sprawling cityscapes of the simulated world, they are constantly dwarfed by digital set extensions that reinforce their insignificance. The scale of these wide shots emphasizes the protagonist's status as a mere data point within an infinite calculation. Yet, through the deliberate use of negative space in the final act, the film pivots. When Neo stops running from the agents and begins to manipulate his environment, the negative space no longer signifies his isolation, it signifies his potential. He is no longer defined by the borders of the screen but has become the architect of the frame itself. The craft of the Matrix is ultimately an act of rebellion, using the medium of cinema to dismantle the very illusions it creates, proving that the boundary between the viewer and the viewed is as fragile as the digital walls Neo finally learns to tear down. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The brilliance of the Matrix lies not merely in its high-concept narrative, but in its aggressive, boundary-pushing integration of the synthetic and the organic. To understand the film's enduring impact, one must look closely at how the Wachowskis utilized the technical uncanny, the friction between the tactile world of practical filmmaking and the burgeoning, often volatile world of digital visual effects. At its most visually dense, the film succeeds by treating the Matrix itself as a character, one that is literally composed of code. When VFX are at their peak, such as during the bullet time sequences or the lobby shootout, they are seamlessly woven into the practical lighting of the environments. The Wachowskis avoided the flat look of early CGI by ensuring that digital elements adhere to the established color temperatures of the scenes. The iconic sickly, digital green tint of the simulation bleeds into the shadows of the live-action performers, creating a unified sensory environment where the boundary between human actor and digital construct effectively dissolves. The film's physics operate on a principle of intentional weight. While characters frequently defy the laws of gravity, they do so within a framework that respects mass and momentum. When Neo or Agent Smith impacts a surface, the collision feels substantial because of the film's clever reliance on high-speed photography and motion capture integrated stunt work. Digital objects, such as the debris raining down during the hallway collapse, possess a visceral weight. They do not simply vanish into the background but interact with the environment, kicking up dust and fracturing in ways that mirror real-world materials. This commitment to physical consistency prevents the audience from drifting into the uncanny valley, as the digital elements are treated as tangible, dangerous entities rather than ethereal overlays. Furthermore, The Matrix is a masterclass in the use of invisible VFX. The most profound technical achievements in the film are often the ones the viewer never notices, the subtle set extensions that turn mundane office buildings into looming, infinite monoliths, or the crowd multiplication sequences that make the city streets feel claustrophobically populated. By using these effects to reinforce the theme of institutional control, the VFX serve the narrative rather than distracting from it. The economic aesthetic of the film, which was born of tight budgeting, actually elevates the tone. Because the Wachowskis could not rely on infinite, sprawling digital landscapes, they focused on highly detailed, localized environments that felt oppressive and tactile. This limitation forced a level of polish that many contemporary, bloated CGI spectacles lack, as every frame is meticulously composed to hide the limits of the technology behind a veil of stylized, high-contrast cinematography. The technical uncanny is most prominent when the film touches upon the nature of the human. The agents, particularly Hugo Weaving Smith, exhibit a terrifyingly precise, almost robotic movement that sits perfectly at the edge of the uncanny valley. By framing the agents as manifestations of the system's logic, the VFX team was able to amplify their movements, making their reflexes seem just a fraction faster than a human's, which highlights their artificiality without ever breaking the suspension of disbelief. This is not a failure of the CGI, but a deliberate exploitation of it. The lack of life in their eyes is not a technical oversight but a manifestation of their nihilistic, programmed purpose. Ultimately, the craft of the Matrix proves that VFX are most effective when they do not attempt to replace reality, but to comment on it. The film's visual language suggests that the real world is gritty, dark, and tactile, while the simulated world is precise, green-hued, and malleable. By mapping these two distinct visual philosophies onto the production design and the post-production work, the film creates a dialectical relationship between the viewer and the screen. The technical execution functions as an epistemological tool, forcing the audience to constantly question the reality of what they are seeing. By the time the screen turns into cascading green rain, we are no longer just looking at a computer monitor, we are viewing the literal, digital architecture of a society built on lies. The synthesis of high-end CGI, practical stunt choreography, and an unwavering commitment to a specific visual grammar ensures that The Matrix remains the gold standard for how cinema can represent the thin, fragile membrane between truth and the technological illusion. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The technical brilliance of The Matrix serves as more than mere spectacle. It is a sophisticated system of sensory manipulation designed to replicate the protagonist's transition from a synthetic, programmed existence to the jagged reality of truth. The Wachowskis utilize a deliberate shift in audiovisual language to differentiate between the two worlds, ensuring the viewer experiences Neo's psychological awakening not just through plot, but through visceral sensory stimuli. Within The Matrix, the sound design is characterized by an oppressive, consistent hum, a sonic representation of the digital architecture that keeps humanity sedated. As Neo begins to doubt his reality, this soundscape becomes increasingly intrusive, with metallic, abrasive textures bleeding into the score, signaling the fraying of his simulated environment. By the time he reaches the Oracle's apartment, the audio perspective narrows, often muting the ambient noise of the simulation to prioritize Neo's internal state, effectively isolating him within his own cognitive dissonance. The rhythm of the film is similarly calculated, employing a precise editing cadence that mirrors the protagonist's shifting agency. In the early sequences, scenes are static, bound by the familiar, predictable pacing of corporate life. However, once Neo is unplugged, the film's tempo becomes erratic, oscillating between the breathless, rapid-fire editing of combat and the jarring, near-silent stillness of the Nebuchadnezzar. This deliberate destabilization of pacing forces the audience to abandon their expectations of linear narrative flow, mimicking the disorientation of a man realizing his reality has been manufactured. The bullet time sequences function as the ultimate synthesis of this sensory manipulation. By slowing the frame rate while maintaining dynamic camera movement, the film physically detaches the viewer from the laws of physics, asserting that in a digital construct, the traditional rules of cinematography, like the permanence of time and space, are merely variables that can be rewritten. Furthermore, the integration of diegetic and non-diegetic sound reaches a crescendo during the film's pivotal philosophical moments. The score, often layered with industrial electronic beats, frequently dissolves into the diegetic environment of the machines, creating a blurring effect where the viewer can no longer distinguish between the music of the film and the hum of the simulation itself. This sonic blending reinforces the film's central epistemological question: if we cannot perceive the boundary between our environment and the code that dictates it, does the distinction matter? Silence is used as a weapon, most notably when Neo is confronted with Morpheus's ultimatum. In these instances, the complete cessation of background audio acts as a void, demanding that the viewer focus entirely on the weight of the moral calculus presented. This sonic and visual architecture is crucial to proving that The Matrix is not merely an action film, but a study of the construction of perception. The film's invisible VFX, such as the subtle color grading that coats The Matrix in a sickly, jaundiced green, work in tandem with this aggressive sound design to ensure the audience feels the sterility of the machine world. Even when the technical execution pushes into high-octane CGI, the film maintains a grounding weight. The impacts in the subway fight feel devastating because the sound design prioritizes the thud of flesh against concrete over the stylized flourishes of the choreography. By anchoring its most fantastical elements in a palpable, tactile sensory experience, the film forces the viewer to confront the fragility of their own perceived reality. Ultimately, the craft and illusion of The Matrix do not merely facilitate the plot, they constitute the narrative itself, proving that in a world defined by information, the most effective rebellion is the ability to perceive the truth through the static of the system. Synthesis of craft. The visual language of The Matrix acts as an extension of its ontological inquiry, utilizing technical craft not merely for spectacle, but as a rigid architecture that mirrors the protagonist's evolving psyche. The Wachowskis, in collaboration with cinematographer Bill Pope, establish a stark dichotomy through lens choice and color grading. The Matrix is rendered in a sickly, jaundiced green, a synthetic palette that signals decay and artificiality, while the real world of the Nebuchadnezzar is bathed in cold, sterile blues. This color-coded geography forces the audience to participate in the epistemic sorting process alongside Neo, teaching us to identify the truth of a scene based on its dominant hue. The film's most revolutionary technical contribution, bullet time, functions as more than a kinetic gimmick, it is a visual metaphor for the transcendence of systemic laws. By marrying long, smooth camera orbits with high-speed photography, the film collapses the boundary between the internal and external. When Neo finally stops the bullets in the climax, the camera movement ceases its reliance on traditional physics. This technical shift confirms the film's central thesis: reality is not a static environment but a malleable construct dictated by the observer's will. The choreography of the frame, particularly during the hallway shootout or the dojo sparring match, uses tight, rhythmic cutting to simulate the claustrophobia of a programmed existence, which then gives way to fluid, wide-angle tracking shots as Neo begins to perceive the code underlying his reality. The lighting strategy employs a sophisticated, near-operatic use of chiaroscuro, particularly in the sequences involving Agent Smith. By shrouding the antagonists in deep, impenetrable shadows while keeping the enlightened characters in harsh, high-contrast illumination, the cinematography visualizes the Jungian struggle between the ego and the shadow. Smith is not merely a program, he is the literal manifestation of the system's rigidity, a shadow self that haunts Neo's every movement. The lighting reflects this pursuit, as the shadows of the Matrix seem to physically encroach upon the light, representing the system's desperate attempt to reclaim its lost property. The production design further reinforces this through the interplay of synthetic versus organic textures. Within the simulation, the sets are sleek, corporate, and frictionless, emphasizing the monotony of a life lived in service to an algorithm. In contrast, the human resistance is defined by tactile, rusted, and analog interfaces, scavenged hardware that feels heavy and grounded in consequence. The VFX integration, which was groundbreaking for 1999, remains effective precisely because the digital elements are treated with the same weight and kinetic inertia as practical objects. When digital debris clatters across a floor, it carries the visual evidence of real-world friction. This attention to detail ensures that the audience never perceives the simulated world as fake in the pejorative sense, but rather as a highly coherent, albeit soul-crushing, manifestation of digital labor. Ultimately, the technical craft of the Matrix serves the philosophical progression of the protagonist. The lens choices compress the background of the real world, trapping the characters in a subterranean existence, while the expansive, gravity-defying camera work inside the Matrix symbolizes a dangerous, boundless liberty. The final reveal, the transition from the grainy, low-contrast misery of the real to the hyperreal, high-contrast liberation of the final shot, proves that the most technically impressive moments are also the most profound. By the film's conclusion, the camera no longer follows the characters, it leads them, signaling that Neo has moved from being a victim of the simulation to its architect. The technical artifice of the film is thus revealed as a mirror to its core argument, that the world we see is only as real as the level of consciousness we bring to it. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. The legacy of the Matrix is not merely found in the technical revolution of bullet time or its aesthetic dominance over turn-of-the-millennium cinema, it resides in its role as a recursive mirror for the digital age. The film's final shot, Neo soaring into the camera, reclaiming the sky as his domain, perfectly mirrors the opening sequence's claustrophobic, monochrome descent into the flickering code of a telephone line. While the former signifies an ascent into godhood, the latter represents the soul's entrapment within the machine. The narrative loop suggests that while Neo has transcended the simulated ego, the system itself remains a perpetual engine of control. By ending with a promise of liberation rather than a dismantling of the machines, the film acknowledges that the struggle for subjective truth is an ongoing process, not a final destination. This unresolved tension serves as the film's most profound philosophical legacy. The Matrix captures the precise anxieties of the late 1990s, the fear of technological obsolescence, the alienation of the post-industrial worker, and the creeping suspicion that the rapid digitization of life was stripping away our shared reality. It acts as a cultural mirror for a generation standing on the precipice of the information explosion, questioning whether the hyperreality of the screen is an expansion of human potential or a digital cage. The brilliance of the film's gap is that it refuses to provide a clean resolution. By leaving the war between humanity and the machines in a state of indefinite flux, it shifts the focus from global salvation to personal awakening. The call to action is not to destroy the machine, but to recognize the architecture of the illusion within one's own life. Technically, the film's innovation was in its seamless marriage of analog physicality and digital abstraction. The uncanny nature of its VFX, the weight of the leather, the tactile grit of the real-world ship, and the hyperkinetic physics of the simulation forced a generation of filmmakers to reconcile the digital with the material. Future artists look back at The Matrix as the moment the medium of film ceased to be a recording of the physical world and became an expression of pure, malleable data. This technical risk-taking validated the medium as a tool for ontological inquiry, proving that the more synthetic an image becomes, the more visceral its emotional truth can feel. If the film had concluded 5 minutes earlier, with Neo's death and resurrection in the hallway, the story would have remained a standard, albeit stylized, mythic hero's journey. By extending the ending, the Wachowskis subvert the chosen one trope. The final image of Neo, no longer bound by the physics of the simulation, standing in the phone booth and promising the system a future of uncertainty, transforms the film into a manifesto of existential rebellion. It suggests that the most radical act is not to defeat the enemy, but to teach the captive population that they are not prisoners. Ultimately, the final metaphor of the film is found in the recurring green cascade of the digital rain. It is both a tool of oppression and, for the liberated, a canvas for liberation. The legacy of The Matrix is that it leaves the viewer trapped in a healthy, productive cycle of questioning. It does not offer the false comfort of an objective ending, instead, it offers the exhilarating danger of a choice. Just as Neo hangs up the phone at the end of the film, the audience is forced to step back into the world and decide whether they will remain spectators to the simulation or architects of their own reality. The film's true success is that it never actually ends, it simply invites the viewer to begin the act of waking up.